Horror movies. If you clicked on this video, you're probably a fan of them. Some of you might even have been fans of them your whole life, but some of you might have just gotten into the genre. The issue with being horror fans is the more you get into the genre, the less starts to affect you, and you don't get scared nearly as easily as before. With that being said, there's usually still a few movies that still give people the creeps no matter how long they have been with the genre. I think every horror fan has a very scary movie when someone asks the question, what's the scariest movie you've ever seen? One of them to me is the Australian Jennifer Kent production, The Babadook. Now, you probably have heard of this film, as it made waves in the horror genre, being on many horror movies of the decade list, with movies like It Follows and Hereditary. Here's the thing though, if you go into this movie expecting some fun, gory monster movie, you will be severely let down because this film, contrary to the popular beliefs of many 14-year-old girls and boys, is a psychological horror about a woman named Amelia and her son dealing with the horror of losing a loved one, in this case, her husband. During this process, she reads a book to her son, which conjures up some ghost, demon, spirit thing called the Babadook. Duke, I honestly don't know how to pronounce it. They changed its name like 14 times in the movie. Enough of me being a retard, let's get back to the film. After summoning the demon, Amelia gets possessed and goes on a murderous rampage. Somehow she gets it out of her and now lives in their basement and they feed it worms like a very odd pet. I grew up complaining about picking up dog poop and Amelia has to feed a demon that can murder her at any time really. Clearly, I have the harder life here. Now that you know what this movie is about, let's begin talking about what makes it such a scary movie, starting with the creature itself, the Babadook. As I mentioned before, the Babadook is not in this movie too often, but every time he does make a humongous impact. There are two scenes where he is clearly seen, and they both are some extremely terrifying scenes. The first is the possession scene. In this scene, Amelia gets possessed. Well, yeah, what the fuck else would happen in this scene? The specific scene I'm talking about is the one where the Babadook crawls around on the ceiling. I don't know what makes this scene so scary, it's not a jump scare, but seeing the Babadook finally, after all this hype, is such a horrifying feeling. I think part of the scares from the scene definitely relate to the design of the monster. Speaking of design, let's talk about that. The character is brilliantly designed by Jennifer Kent and Alexander Juhaza? I think Alexander described it perfectly. He said, he wears a mask with a fixed expression, a misguided approximation of what it thinks a man is. I'll link the article he says this in below. You should give it a read. It actually is very interesting. The Babadook is scary though, because it's not a monster and it's not a man. It's the nightmare you find when you look between both of them. The other thing you need to remember is that the Babadook isn't just a monster. It represents something much worse than that. But before we talk about that, let's talk about the second scene. This scene isn't nearly as scary, but it still gives me a really bad feeling. This scene is the cartoon scene. Late at night, Amelia is watching TV and an old-timey cartoon comes on, which overall just looks terrifying. And we get to see the Babadook on the screen. A clear look at how unusually lanky and tall it is, and its unsettling fingers. Well, it just smiles at you blankly, with no comfort. Something about it all is just unsettling. Let's remember though that the Babadook represents something too, and that's grief. More specifically, Amelia's grief. Speaking of Amelia, Amelia is a rare example of our protagonist being an antagonist for most of the movie, but I think Kent pulls this off brilliantly. Grief can turn a good person wrong sometimes, and I think a great way to look at the film is through the 5 stages of grief, starting with denial. Amelia doesn't want to believe her husband is dead. She says she's past it, but doesn't let anyone bring him up. Next stage is anger, and I think this starts in the car ride when she screams, "Why can't you be normal?" at her son. Next is depression, the feeling of being overwhelmed, which Amelia literally is overwhelmed in the form of possession. She loses herself in grief. Bargaining is the fourth, which I see as blaming it on yourself, like why didn't I do this or why didn't I do that? Which makes sense because the Babadook pretending to be Amelia's dead husband says, "Bring me the boy, and I can come back," which is literally bargaining for life. But she eventually realizes she can't get rid of grief, aka the Babadook. But she can accept it, hence the ending where she turns the thing into a family pet. Which means the 5th stage, acceptance, is completed. I think this is an amazing ending and could not have been done better, because as someone who recently lost my dog, the message feels heartfelt, genuine, and realistic. You can't change if someone dies, but you can accept it. This ending is bittersweet ending, but it is a scary one as well. What if it finds a way out of the basement? What happens then? Will it be peaceful, or will it try to do everything over again? The ending will be interpreted differently by everyone. I like to think they become friends with the Babadook and it just becomes the family dog, but who cares about what I think? Let's get to why the Babadook is so scary. But before that, let's talk about Samuel. I've yet to talk about the second biggest character in this movie, Samuel. Samuel is Amelia's son, and right after we are introduced to him, we can immediately tell he's not the most normal type of kid. He probably talks about his dad dying like it's some sort of badge of honor and makes little weapons. You want to hire this kid 5-minute crafts? Because you're not doing life hacks at this point. Cut back to the movie though. Even though Amelia is our protagonist, Samuel ends up being her victim throughout the movie. In the beginning, she just berates him, which at points is very justified. We soon learn that he does not have birthdays because his mother is in denial still, so he does not get to have something most children remember fondly. And of course his mom just straight up tries to murder him in the climax of the film. Imagine if your parents tried to murder you after you broke something. Every time I shattered a glass, I would just start booking it out the door. Here's the thing though, even though Samuel has been Amelia's victim his entire life, he also realizes she has been his victim because he's not a normal kid and gets in trouble very often. So he loves his mom and Amelia still loves him. When the school calls him the boy, she immediately claps back, and of course she does not sacrifice Samuel. And Samuel, when he was about to be murdered, says he still loves his mom. So overall, I think Samuel gives us the message of loving your loved ones when they need it most. Now that I've talked about every character, let's get to what makes the Babadook so scary. The Babadook is scary because everybody who watches it either has felt like Amelia or dreads the day they will feel like Amelia. We all fear the day we lose someone close to us, and we also fear never being able to recover from it, and realizing they will never come back. We fear the Babadook because it is a lot more real than a monster. We fear the possession scene because it is a lot more than a demon finding a body to inhabit. It is a woman losing the fight to grief, and we all worry one day we will be in her shoes. If the ending teaches us anything, though, is you can't get rid of grief, but you can cope with it. And in the end, if you keep fighting, you will win. The Babadook represents the inevitability of grief and death, and no matter how much you run from it, grief will eventually find you. Thanks.